They do not stand, they prevail. Before the first sunrise of the exile, the east of Eden was a silent wound. Then came the sound of 1,000 rushing cataracts, not of water, but of burning bronze. The cherubim descended, not as men with wings, but as a storm of geometry and fire. For faces, the predator, the servant, the king, and the soaring spirit, locked into a single, shifting form that defied the laws of the new, cold earth. Between them, the ever-turning sword ignited, a jagged rift of white heat that didn't just cut the air, but unmade it. Adam looked back and saw only the eyes, 10,000 unblinking stars set into the wings of the guardians, watching the exact moment the horizon became a wall, and the garden became a ghost. The air in Eden had always tasted like honey and sunlight. But as Adam and Eve took their final steps toward the edge of the garden, the air turned to iron. The sky, once a soft blue, bruised into a deep, heavy purple. Behind them, the home they had known, the whispering trees and the quiet rivers, was being swallowed by a mist that felt like a closing door. Then, the silence broke. It wasn't a thunderclap. It was a sound like 1,000 waterfalls hitting hot bronze. A vibration started in the ground, rattling the bones of the first humans until they fell to their knees. In the center of the path, the space between the trees began to tear. Out of the light came the cherubim. They did not look like the statues men would later build. They were a storm of wings and shifting faces. One moment, the golden face of a lion roared in the light, the next, the heavy, patient brow of an ox appeared. There was the sharp, piercing eye of an eagle and the weeping face of a man. All four lived in one body, turning without moving, seeing everything at once. Their wings were not soft feathers. They were woven from polished metal and living flame. And as they unfolded, Adam saw the most terrifying part: the wings were covered in eyes. Thousands of unblinking, sapphire blue eyes that watched the stars, the earth, and the trembling hearts of the two people before them. These were the watchers of the throne, and their gaze was a weight no mortal could carry. Then came the sword. Between the two guardians, a rift of white fire ignited. It was a blade of light that had no hilt and no hand to hold it. It turned and spiraled in the air, a wheel of screaming flame that cut the very wind in half. It was the ever-turning sword, a boundary made of pure holiness. Adam reached out a hand, a desperate instinct to go back, to touch the soil of the garden one last time. But the heat from the sword was not just hot, it was true. It was a fire that burned away everything that was not perfect. He realized then that the cherubim weren't there to be cruel. They were there because the garden and the fallen could no longer occupy the same space. Step back, the vibration seemed to say, though no lips moved. The sound came from the beating of the metallic wings. The first sunset of the exile began. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the outer wilderness, the only light left was the terrifying glow of the guardians. Their bronze skin shimmered in the dark, and the flaming sword carved a line in the dirt that no man could ever cross again. Humanity turned away into the shadows. Behind them, the eyes of the cherubim remained open, guarding the glory of the beginning until the end of time. The world outside the garden was harsh. The ground was stubborn, yielding thorns instead of fruit, and the wind carried a bite that the first humans had never felt before. As years turned into decades, the children of Adam grew into a tribe. They built fires to keep away the dark, but their eyes always turned toward the east. In the east, the sky never truly went dark. A steady, pulsing amber glow marked the place where the world ended. A group of young men, led by a seeker named Enoch, decided they would find a way back. They carried gifts of grain and polished stones, hoping to bargain with the guardians. They believed that if they were quiet enough or fast enough, they could slip past the fire. As they approached the border, the air began to hum. It wasn't the sound of wind, it was the sound of machinery made of spirit. Suddenly, the dust of the desert began to swirl. From the clouds of sand, the cherubim appeared, taller than any mountain the men had ever climbed. But this time, they weren't alone. Alongside the four-faced creatures were the Ophanim, the wheels within wheels. These were not made of wood or iron. They were giant rings of burning beryl, spinning in every direction at once. They moved with the cherubim like a chariot of living light. Most terrifying of all, the rims of the wheels were crowded with eyes. Thousands of sapphire-colored eyes that blinked in unison, tracking every heartbeat of the men on the ground. The seekers froze. The wheels did not roll, they flashed like lightning from one spot to another. One moment they were a mile away, the next, they were hovering directly above the men, casting a shadow that felt as heavy as lead. Enoch stepped forward, his voice trembling. "We have brought offerings," he shouted against the roar of the spinning fire. "We wish to return to the peace of the beginning." The cherubim did not strike them down. Instead, the lion face turned toward them, and the eagle face looked down from above. A vibration moved through the ground, a voice that felt like a deep bell ringing inside their chests. "The peace you seek is no longer in the soil," the vibration echoed. "The way is closed, not by our hate, but by your shadow." The wheels within wheels began to spin faster, creating a wall of wind and light that pushed the men back. The eyes on the wheels glowed with a fierce, knowing light. They saw the greed in some of the men's hearts and the fear in others. They were the watchers of the limit, and they knew that if a man touched the tree of life while his heart was full of darkness, he would live in that darkness forever. The seekers realized then that the cherubim were not just guards, they were protectors of a boundary that kept the universe from shattering. As the sun set, the wheels retreated into the amber mist, leaving the men standing in the cold dust. Enoch looked at his shaking hands. He understood now, the garden wasn't just a place they had lost, it was a purity they were no longer heavy enough to hold. Centuries had passed since the days of Enoch. The memory of the living guardians had faded into legends told around desert fires. The descendants of the first humans were no longer lone wanderers, they were a nation, Israel, moving through a vast, howling wilderness. One night, high atop a mountain wrapped in smoke and lightning, a new command was given to their leader, Moses. God did not just want to stay in the distant heavens, he wanted a dwelling place among his people. But to build that place, they had to recreate the boundary of Eden. The task fell to a craftsman named Bezalel. He was a man who saw the world in shapes of gold and shadows of blue. As he stood before a massive block of pure, beaten gold, his hands trembled. He wasn't just making art, he was being asked to pull a memory out of the collective soul of humanity. "Build me 2 cherubim," the command had said. "Place them on the lid of the Arkansas." As Bezalel began to hammer the gold, a strange stillness fell over his workshop. The smell of burning olive oil filled the air, but beneath it, he smelled something else, the scent of ancient cedar and ozone, the smell of a storm that never broke. He didn't carve them with 4 faces this time. Following the pattern shown to Moses, he shaped them with the faces of heavenly messengers, their wings stretched high and wide. He hammered the gold until the wings were thin enough to vibrate with the wind. When the work was finished, the 2 golden guardians stood facing each other. Their wings arched upward, meeting in the middle to create a canopy of gold. This space beneath the wings was called the mercy seat. It was a mystery that confused the people. "Why are they facing downward?" they whispered. "Why do they hide their eyes?" Bezalel knew the answer. In the garden, the cherubim looked outward to keep man away from the holy. But here, inside the tabernacle, they looked downward to guard the place where God's voice would speak. They were no longer just a wall, they were a frame for a presence. The day the tabernacle was finished, the priests carried the ark into the most holy place. The room was draped in heavy curtains of blue, purple, and scarlet, colors of the bruised sky at Eden's gate. Woven into those curtains were more cherubim, their threadwork shimmering in the dim light of the golden lampstand. As the priests stepped back, a thick, heavy cloud descended. The Shekinah, the glory of God, filled the room. Inside the darkness of the tent, the gold of the cherubim began to glow, not from a lamp, but from the heat of the presence sitting between them. For the first time since the exile, the fire did not push man away. The fire sat quietly between the wings, waiting. The cherubim were still there, silent and terrifying in their beauty, but they had changed their stance. They were no longer guarding a closed door, they were keeping watch over a promise. Chapter 4, The Chariot of the Exile. The silence of the tabernacle was shattered centuries later, not in the holy city of Jerusalem, but in the dust of a slave camp. The people of Israel were no longer in their land, they were captives in Babylon, sitting by the banks of the Chebar Canal. Among them was a priest named Ezekiel. He was staring at the horizon, wondering if God had stayed behind in the ruined temple. Then, the north wind began to scream. It wasn't a normal storm. A massive cloud approached, glowing with an amber light that seemed to have a fire folded inside itself. As it drew closer, the sky became a sea of terrible crystal, blinding and vast. From the center of the fire, the cherubim returned. But they were no longer the silent, golden statues of the tabernacle. They were alive. They were the living creatures, and they moved with the speed of a lightning bolt. Their four faces, the man, the lion, the ox, and the eagle, sparkled like burnished bronze in a furnace. Under their four wings, they had the hands of a man. They did not turn as they moved, they went straight forward, a wall of divine intent that nothing could stop. Above their heads was a canopy that looked like a frozen ocean, and above that ocean was a throne made of sapphire. Ezekiel fell on his face. The sound of their wings was like the roar of the Mediterranean Sea or the shouting of a massive army. But the most incredible part was the wheels. The Ophanim he saw were even more complex than the ones Enoch had glimpsed. They were wheels within wheels, colored like sparkling chrysolite, and they were so high they were dreadful. They were full of eyes, watching every corner of the earth at once. Where the Spirit went, they went, Ezekiel whispered into the dust. The journey that began at the dusty gates of Eden reached its end in a place where time itself had died. The Apostle John stood upon a floor that looked like glass mingled with fire. Before him sat the throne, and around the throne were the four living creatures. They were no longer guarding a path or carrying a chariot through the clouds of Babylon. They had reached their final station. They were the same beings Adam had feared and Ezekiel had described, but here, in the full light of the beginning and the end, their true purpose was revealed. They were covered in eyes, before, behind, and within, because in the presence of the Almighty, there is nothing that can stay hidden. They saw the past, the present, and the future as a single, beautiful thread. Day and night, they never rested. But they were no longer silent. The roar of their wings had become a song. Holy, 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 they cried, their voices shaking the foundations of heaven. As they sang, something incredible happened. The ever-turning sword that had stood between humanity and the garden for thousands of years was gone. The barrier was open. A great crowd of people from every nation and tongue began to walk toward the throne. As the people passed, the cherubim did not reach for a weapon. They did not flash their bronze wings to push the mortals back. Instead, the lion, the ox, the man, and the eagle bowed. The guardians of the limit became the leaders of the worship. One of the creatures, the one with the face of a man, looked at the approaching crowd. In its sapphire eyes, there was no longer the dread of the exile. There was the recognition of a long-awaited reunion. The cherubim had kept the holy place pure for this exact moment, the day when the dwellers of the dust were finally clean enough to step into the fire. The garden was no longer a lost memory. It had grown into a city. The tree of life, once guarded by a blade of flame, now stood in the center of the street, its leaves dipping into a river as clear as crystal. The cherubim folded their 6 wings. Their work as sentries was finished. They had watched the fall, they had marched through the exile, and now, they stood as the eternal witnesses to the return. The shadow of the four-faced guardians was swallowed up by the light that had no need of a sun, and for the first time since the beginning, the sword was still. The story of the cherubim is not a story of monsters at the gate, but of mercy wearing a terrifying mask. They stood in the gap when we could not, preserving the holiness of God until the day we could be invited back in. The sword that once turned against us has been sheathed, and the guardians who once stood as a wall now stand as a welcome. The gate is open. The fire no longer consumes, it cleanses. Will you step beyond the threshold and behold the glory that the guardians have protected for eons? Subscribe and journey deeper into the mysteries of the Word.